Thank you for joining me. In Judaism, we have what we call the yearly cycle. This is the cycle of our Hagim, our fast days, our minor holidays. And they come around every year. From the first to the last, they form a cycle. They end up where they started, and then the next year we begin again. So this yearly cycle or circle, this is fundamental to Judaism, but it's not the only circle that's fundamental to Judaism. There's another one that is of critical importance, I think you'll agree, and that is the circle that's found in the game of Jewish geography. Let me give you an example. So suppose I go to services one Shabbat morning, and there's a bat mitzvah there. And at the Kiddush after services, I meet one of the out-of-town guests, a man named Joel. I ask Joel where he's from. He says he's from Atlanta. So I take a wild shot. I know there are a lot of Jews in Atlanta. But I say, by any chance know John Schwartz? He says, as a matter of fact, John Schwartz belongs to my temple. I don't know him that well, but our sons are good friends. They're in the same Hebrew school class. So, okay, that's Jewish geography. And you see the circle in it. It starts with me, goes to Joel's son, to John Schwartz's son, to John Schwartz, and back to me. It's the fact that John Schwartz and I are connected. Maybe we're friends. That's how this started. So there's a circle in that. And one way you know that this circle is fundamental to us is that if you ever watch people play Jewish geography, you'll see that they're happy. They're smiling. You never see people saying, "Hey, do you know John Schwartz?" No, it doesn't work like that. So people are happy. It's a game that brings pleasure, but it's a game that's also has some importance attached to it. And that has to do with the fact that we are the post-Holocaust generation or generations. And that means that for many of us, our extended families are not really as large as they ought to be. So when we play Jewish geography, we are, in effect, bringing someone else into the fold. And it's that circularity, the way the chain of individuals comes back to where it started and kind of locks at the end like a necklace that really adds value to the game and really helps to bring a new person, in effect, into your family. Now, there's another game that we play. It's a little bit like Jewish geography. One of the names it goes by is 6 degrees of separation. So that might go like this. I have a cousin, and my cousin's friend, that guy's mother is Liev Schreiber's agent. So this goes from me to my cousin, to my cousin's friend, to that person's mother, to Liev Schreiber. 4 degrees of separation between me and Liev Schreiber. I don't know if there are actually that many degrees of separation. I made up both those examples, but I think they illustrate the point. And one of the points about 6 degrees of separation is that, yes, that's also a fun game to play. People are generally happy when they play it. But it doesn't have the effect that Jewish geography does of bringing a new person into your family. And that's because it doesn't come back and lock on the end, doesn't come back to where it started. It doesn't have that strong effect, even if all the people involved in the sequence of individuals are all Jewish. That doesn't matter. Liev Schreiber is Jewish. Doesn't matter. But sometimes, doesn't happen very often, but every now and then, you play a game of 6 degrees of separation, and it does work its way back around to the beginning, back to you where it started. It's not very common, but it does happen. And when that happens, the game becomes a sort of hybrid of Jewish geography and 6 degrees of separation. So what we're going to do now, or what I'm going to do, is walk you through an example, the best example I know of where a game of 6 degrees of separation actually works its way back to its starting point. And there are a lot of individuals involved here. There are 9 people in this chain. So let me show you a little roadmap. I think that will help keep you oriented as we go through this sequence of people. So let me share the screen here. And you should now see this roadmap. You see the name Esther on the bottom. If you start going around counterclockwise, you see the names Leon, Erna, Ruth, Oren, Amin, Sufyan, and then a couple of question marks. The question marks we'll save to the end. Those are people whose names we don't actually know, but we know a lot about them. So that will work out. So we start with Esther, and we're going to start going around the circle counterclockwise. Now, just one comment before we do this. I started at the beginning. I began by mentioning our yearly cycle of Jewish Hagim, Jewish holidays. And in that cycle, at every stop along the way, at every holiday, fast day, whatever it may be, we come to that day and either we celebrate or we fast. Either way, we pray. And if you look at that cycle as a whole, then you could say that the central focus of it is nothing less than our lives as Jews. In this case, the case of this circle of people, this circle of names we're going to be working through, the focus is actually the Holocaust. And as we get to each name along the circle, we're not going to celebrate, we're not going to fast, we're not going to pray. We're just going to tell a little story or two at each stop along the way. All right, so let's begin. Let's begin with that first person, that first name. That's Esther. Let me show you a picture of Esther. Here's a picture of Esther as a young woman. Her full name is Esther Crone. And this is a picture of her as a young woman in New York, maybe in the late 1920s, early 1930s. You can tell she has a sort of flapper kind of thing going on. It was the style of the time, that sort of hat that she's got, and the fur collar and everything. So, as I said, this photo was taken in New York. But Esther didn't always live in New York. She was actually born in Poland and grew up in Poland until she was a teenager. Not until she was a teenager did she emigrate to the United States. In Poland, she lived in the town of Stryj, that's Stryj. And that was a town in southeastern Poland. Today, it's a town in southwestern Ukraine. So before we continue with Esther's story, I want to actually spend a few minutes talking about this town of Stryj. There are a couple of things about the town that are worth mentioning. First of all, Esther and her family, her large family, their native language was Polish. Even though they were Jewish, they spoke Polish and not Yiddish. In fact, they didn't know Yiddish. And I found this to be kind of interesting because a few years ago in 2018, my wife Sheila and I went to Poland, to Warsaw for a conference. And before we went to Poland, I thought it would be interesting if I could learn a little bit of Polish. So I began a study of Polish, and I had a chance at some point before we left to talk to a professor of Jewish studies at Mount Holyoke College. And I asked this person, was Yiddish or Polish the predominant language among Polish Jews in before the war? I knew certainly that many Jews spoke Yiddish, but was there any sizable number of them who spoke Polish, perhaps Polish and not Yiddish at all? And he said, yeah, he thought there were actually a good number of Jews like that. They might tend to be assimilated, live in cities, but he didn't have an exact number on that. Well, here's something we do have somewhat of a good number about. We know that before the war, the population of Stryj was about 30,000. And we know that a little more than a third of that population was Jewish, about 11,000. Today in Stryj, there is no Jewish community. There may be some Jews still living there. If there are, it's like a handful, like 6, something like that. One more thing about Stryj before we get back to Esther. And this is something I find really fascinating. So when Sheila and I were in Warsaw, we met a young woman who was a jewelry maker. And this young woman had taken upon herself a remarkable project. So what she did was she would go around, she'd travel to little towns all over Poland, and some in Western Ukraine as well. I think that these days in 2023, she's probably not spending any time in Western Ukraine. But in any case, she would travel around to these towns that had a significant Jewish population before the war and now have no Jewish population. And she would go to each town, and in these towns, she would look for what she called traces. Now, what did she mean by that? Or what did she mean by a trace? Well, let me illustrate that with an example. Let me show you a picture here. I'll share the screen again. So yeah, let's look at this. So what you're looking at here is a street in the town of Stryj today. And Stryj is a town that this young woman visited, and she took that picture. And that is a street where Jews used to live. And we know that because this jewelry maker found traces there. Now, what does she mean by that? What is a trace? Well, I'm going to show you. Here is a trace. What you're looking at here is an image from a doorpost in one of the doors on that street you were just looking at. And the outline you see, this sort of ghost image, that's the image of where a mezuzah used to be. And this is a fairly large mezuzah. You see that there was probably some sort of crown ornament on the top of the mezuzah case, because you can see in this picture toward the top of the trace, there's like an extra sort of backing with a couple of fasteners there. You see a couple of nail holes. So that's a trace. What this jeweler would do, this young woman, when she found a trace like that, she'd make a wax impression of it. Take that wax impression back to her studio in Warsaw and cast from that a new brass mezuzah case. And now you'd have a new, beautiful new mezuzah case where the pattern on the front is this trace, this imprint, this sort of ghost imprint on a doorpost where there used to be a mezuzah before the war. And let me show you here an example of this young woman's work. This is a mezuzah case, brass mezuzah case that she cast. See nail holes here. And this pattern on the front that comes from a trace, that's from the very trace that I just showed you a picture of from the town of Street. Okay, now let's get back to Esther. Esther was one of 5 children, but when she emigrated to the United States, she came by herself. That's because she came over as a teenager, and by that time, in the 1920s, her 4 older siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, who were much older than she was, they were all settled. They weren't going anywhere. They were married. They had kids. They had jobs, houses. Let me show you a picture of Esther with one of her sisters. So in this picture, you see Esther on the left. She's the little girl. This is a picture taken in Street in Poland. So you can see just from the picture, without knowing anyone's age, that sister is much older than Esther, that little girl sitting next to her there. So again, when Esther came to America, she came alone. Now, if you have ever seen the play or seen the TV miniseries Angels in America, if you haven't seen it, you really should. It's wonderful. The TV miniseries you can probably rent from your library. It's got a wonderful cast. Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, Emma Thompson, a bunch of others. In that play, in the very first scene, you have a funeral. It's a funeral in Brooklyn, and an old rabbi is eulogizing a woman. This is a rabbi from the old country. He's got an accent, and he's never met this woman. He's speaking to the people who have gathered at her funeral, and there aren't very many. There are like 8 or 10 of them, her kids and her grandkids, maybe 1 or 2 others. So there aren't many people there. He didn't even know her. But like him, she came over from the old country, from somewhere in Eastern Europe. She made the trip over here. And he spends a moment talking about that. And I'm going to read to you what he said. And I'll even do a bit of an accent here. You'll forgive me for that. I'll try to do this with the emphasis and the intonation that I heard the rabbi use in the miniseries when I saw it. So talking about this woman, you can never make that crossing that she made, for such great voyages in this world do not anymore exist. But every day of your lives, the miles, the voyage from that place to this one, you cross every day. In you is that journey. Really, I hope you do forgive me for that accent. Incidentally, the actor who played that rabbi, of course, a professional actor, did that with a perfect accent, really nailed it. And this old man with the Eastern European accent, this old rabbi, was played by, wait for it, Meryl Streep. She can do anything. It's amazing. All right, let me show you another one of Esther's siblings. We saw one of her sisters. I want to show you one of her brothers now. Okay, here you see her brother. That's her brother with the brother's wife. And the brother's name is Leon. He's actually the next point on our circle. And there isn't actually that much to say about Leon, because Leon and his wife were killed in the Holocaust. Not only Leon and his wife, but all of Esther's older siblings, their spouses, their children, all of them were murdered. Now, Leon's wife, who you also see here in the same picture, is named Erna, and she is the next point on the circle. Erna was Erna Krohn when she was married to Leon, but before that she was Erna Treubner. And Erna had a brother, Richard, who escaped the Holocaust and who actually survived in Poland through the war and for several years after the war. Richard had a daughter named Ruth, and let me show you a picture of her. This is Ruth, the daughter of Richard, the niece of Erna Krohn. And Ruth lived in Poland as a young woman. Eventually, her family emigrated to Israel, to Tel Aviv. And she has lived most of her life since in Tel Aviv and New York, some of the time in each place. Right now, she lives mainly in New York. Ruth is a poet. And I am going to read you a fragment of one of her poems. So this is a longer poem that was written about. She wrote about her childhood in Poland. I'm just going to read the first few lines. Frosted snowflakes on the window overlooking the gray market square. Frosted glass globes on the Christmas tree of the elderly couple sharing our apartment. A chorus of emptiness from the grocery store shelves. A chorus of stillness. For me, this sense of emptiness, stillness, quiet that you get in this poem, that evokes death. And to reinforce that, to give you a better sense of that, I'm going to read part of another poem as well, where, again, sort of stillness, silence, quiet, they serve to evoke death. And this is a poem by the poet Carl Shapiro. Carl Shapiro grew up in New York, and he went to college at the University of Virginia. And that was in the 1930s. He did not have a good experience there. Experienced anti-Semitism regularly there, and he wrote a poem about it. The poem is called University. And I'm just going to read the first few lines. To hurt the Negro and avoid the Jew is the curriculum. In mid-September, the entering boys, identified by hats, wander in a maze of mannered brick where boxwood and magnolia brood, and columns with imperious stance, like rows of antebellum girls, eye them, outlanders. In whited cells on lawns equipped for peace, under the arch and lofty banister, equals shake hands, unequals blankly pass. The exemplary weather whispers, quiet, quiet, and visitors on tiptoe leave. You have this explicit sense of quiet, but you also have an implicit stillness there. The columns are like antebellum girls that eye the outlanders. All those columns are perfectly still. And here too, I think the stillness, the quiet, evokes a sense of death. I think death infuses this poem. Now, in fact, no one dies in this poem. There's no death. There's really nothing but people who hate other people. May not be death, but it's close enough. And one other point I want to make about this way that silence and stillness can evoke death in a work of art. Just to add a little texture to this, I want us to look at a piece of visual art that has the same effect. So let me show you that. You may be familiar with this. This is a painting by Edward Hopper, the great American artist, Edward Hopper. This is probably his most famous work. It's called Nighthawks. And again, for me, this painting evokes death. Now, how is that? Well, imagine you're in the scene, standing outside of that diner looking in. You certainly won't hear anything from inside the diner. The folks will look quiet there anyway. It's quiet, it's clean, it's still. And you don't hear anything outside the diner either. Look, there's no one there. The streets are clean. There's no trash on the street. There are no cars. That may be late at night, but there are no parked cars either. Look at the building across the way. No curtains in the windows. There's one room that seems to be partially lit. But if you had a larger image, you might be able to detect that by looking into that window, you see nothing. So I think this again makes the point, gives us a sense of how stillness and silence evoke death. For life, you need some noise, you need some untidiness. You don't have it in these poems. You don't have it in this image. So back to Ruth. Ruth is married, and among her children is a man named Oren, and he's the next step on our circle. Ruth's married name is Kessler, so her son is Oren Kessler, and maybe that name is familiar. This year, 2023, he came out with a book that's getting a lot of buzz. Let me show you the cover of the book. Here it is. I can get it in focus here. There we are. Let's see it. Palestine, 1936. Sheila and I heard Oren Kessler talk about this book a few weeks ago. We went to a local synagogue here, and he talked about it briefly. He, unfortunately, the time that was allotted to him was the time it takes to give a sermon on Shabbat morning. His talk was the sermon. So he had a sermon length amount of time, and he acknowledged that. He said, well, I don't have much time, so I'll do two brief things. First, I'll tell you why I wrote the book. And second, I'll tell you a little bit about one of the more interesting characters in the book. So why did he write the book? The book is called Palestine 1936, but it covers a period of time, 1936 to 1939, in mandatory Palestine, that is Palestine under the British. And those years, that period of time, was the time of what's called the Great Arab Revolt. One of the more interesting characters that played a role in that revolt is one of the leaders of the revolt. And he is the next point on our circle. His name is Amin. And he was kind of a controversial leader because as time went on, his focus seemed more and more to be not on some sort of success for the Arab population in Palestine, but rather to just kill Jews at any cost. He was virulently anti-Semitic. He was a confidant of Hitler. He made public statements that sometimes made Hitler sound tame, if you can believe that. His full name was Amin al-Husseini, and he had a title that was given to him by the British. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Now, maybe you are familiar with him by that name. Yeah, he was notorious, just an awful guy. I think I've said enough about him. I don't want to say anymore. And why is he even in the circle here? Well, because he's a stepping stone to the next person. So let's get on with that. One of the things about Amin was that he had a large family, several brothers, for example, several brothers and sisters. And one of his brothers, and this particular brother, I don't know if this guy uh, agreed with Amin's attitudes about things, whether he tried to distance himself from his brother. But I do know that as soon as he could, as soon as the war was over, he got out of there and he emigrated to the United States. Out of there, meaning out of Lebanon. His family lived in Lebanon for the duration of the war. So he emigrated to the United States, specifically to New Jersey. I don't know, he was married. Maybe his wife had relatives in New Jersey. I don't know. I don't know what the story was there. But he and his wife had a son, Sufyan, and Sufyan's the next point on our circle. Sufyan was born in 1930, so he was a teenager, and this family came to New Jersey. And he went to high school in New Jersey. Then he went to college in New Jersey at Rutgers. At Rutgers, he was a math major, and he was a brilliant math major. So he was able to get into one of the real premier math graduate programs, not just in America, but frankly in the world. And that was the Princeton graduate program. So still in New Jersey. He went to graduate school there at Princeton, got a PhD, and ended up as a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He was an interesting professor at the University of Wisconsin for a couple of reasons. One, he had a way of teaching where, when introducing some new technique or new theorem, whatever it may be, he tried to explain what the use of this technique would be. Why would you want to know this thing? What could you do with it that you couldn't do without it? He wanted to give you a feel for it, build your intuition before you even knew the details of the thing. Now, this is an unusual way of teaching math or anything else. But frankly, I think we'd all be better off if everything were taught that way. Seems like a natural approach to teaching, and this is how Sufyan taught. Now, in addition to this particular way of teaching, he also was a very kind, patient, and supportive teacher. And I know that because I was a student of his. I am the first question mark you come to as you go around the circle. I said we didn't know the names of those question marks, but now we know it's me. I'm the first question mark. So I was a student of Sufyan, and I found him indeed to be friendly, supportive, and patient with me. He needed a lot of patience. But for all his support and goodwill, I never brought up with him in discussion with him any political topics, anything having to do with Israel. And he never brought that stuff up in speaking with me. I guess we kind of tacitly agreed to keep our eye on the mathematical ball. And to this day, I wonder what his views might have been. I'll never really know. He died 5 years ago. But from time to time, I think about this, and I think how strange it is that one of my beloved professors was the nephew of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Well, we come to the last point on the circle, the double question mark that you might remember. And we know who that is as well. That's my wife, Sheila. Her connection to me is that she's my wife. But to really lock the circle together in the end, there has to be a connection between Sheila and Esther, where we started. And there is indeed such a connection. Esther was Sheila's mother. So, as the radio personality Paul Harvey used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. We've completed the cycle. And for me, there are a number of striking things here. I mean, one example I already gave you, I think it's striking that this Jewish boy had this wonderful teacher who is the nephew of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. But more striking than that, and most striking of all, I think, is this connection between Sheila and Ruth. Let me go back again and show you a picture we've already looked at. This is Leon and Erna Crone. Well, now we know that Leon is Sheila's uncle. Erna is Ruth's aunt. And we know that Sheila and Ruth never met their aunt and uncle. Their aunt and uncle were murdered in the Holocaust. And I can tell you that there is no other connection between Sheila and Ruth. But that one connection, Leon and Erna, that one connection is enough. Because of that connection, Sheila and Ruth are family. So this complete cycle completes my story. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and take care all. Thank you.